Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk about how short Fat Otaku has chosen to lie about his claims that Donald Trump tried to steal the election with the Eastman Memo. And yes, Dev is still harping on the Eastman Memo as the one and only thing that he needs to somehow criticize Trump and find him utterly irredeemable. Of course, Dev's latest attempts at this claim comes from a nearly 4-hour long video, which he apparently hoped that people like me wouldn't be bothered to actually go through all the way. Of course, that video is so long under the pretense that it would include all the evidence and be utterly comprehensive, except that is demonstrably not the case. And to start off, let's talk about some of the things that Dev fails to bring up in his nearly 4-hour long video. The first being that the Eastman Memo was apparently so utterly illegal that Congress had to pass a brand new law afterwards to prevent another Eastman Memo sort of situation, which directly implies that it wasn't actually illegal to have an alternate slate of electors. And don't worry, we'll be getting back to that a little bit more throughout this video. But the point is that completely omitting the fact that the Eastman Memo led to completely new legislation, and completely failing to mention that legislation at all, evidence that just so happens to directly discredit the position that the Eastman Memo was an illegal coup attempt, well, that is quite a glaring omission if there ever was one, especially for what is supposed to be a completely comprehensive video that is almost 4 hours long. It's even more damning when you realize that Dev took the extra time instead to demonstrate the link between the presidential election of 1876 to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. So apparently Dev found it important to talk about the legal ramifications of the constitutional crisis surrounding the 1876 presidential election, but couldn't be bothered to talk about the law that the Eastman Memo helped create. Another glaring lie by omission I feel needs to be brought up happens to surround the claims that Dev believes that the majority of Trump's staff thought that the Eastman Memo was flat out illegal. He does this in part by falsely reframing a lot of the statements from the staff, statements of Trump's former staff claiming that the Eastman Memo was a bad idea that wasn't going to work, and choosing to resign over that, as instead them claiming that it was somehow outright illegal. I say this because let's look at the words of Bill Barr, a source that Dev uses frequently throughout the video, who did resign as a result of the Eastman Memo situation, but also has gone on to openly state that there was nothing inherently illegal about the Eastman Memo, a statement that Dev again carefully omits from the video.
I'm just wondering, if you had talked to John Eastman and, if you knew about the slate of electors, because I thought his memo was pretty persuasive.
Well, his idea that the vice president could change things is crazy.
Yeah.
There's nothing inherently wrong with naming an alternative slate of electors. There's nothing wrong with that.
So yes, as you can see, Bill Barr does say that the Eastman Memo was a crazy idea, and that is a fair critique. However, he also goes on to say explicitly that it was a legal idea, that having an alternate slate of electors was not a violation of the law. It is worth noting that most of the testimonies that Dev provides as proof that the legal team thought the Eastman Memo was outright illegal ultimately appears to be following in this line of reasoning, that it was a crazy idea, but there is no damning statements about it being actually illegal, with a handful of exceptions. It's just extremely inconvenient for Dev that those handful of statements just so happen to come from people who were compromised because they were coached secretly by Liz Cheney, who just so happened to be on the committee that was interrogating them. And yes, this has been 100% proven, here are the texts to prove it, but again, that is yet another fact that gets oh so conveniently left out by Dev in his 4-hour long comprehensive look at the Eastman Memo. And so far, the 3 pieces of evidence that Dev has omitted just so happen to be pieces of evidence that directly contradict his claim that the Eastman Memo was an illegal coup attempt. But wait, it gets even better, because he also went out of his way to directly defend the Jan 6 committee against accusations that it would be biased and potentially corrupt, on the grounds that the Republicans shot themselves in the foot, and that it's also just a wild conspiracy theory bro. Leaving aside the fact that people on the committee were directly coaching the so-called witnesses on how to respond to specific questions. questions. It is worth mentioning for the record that Dev did, however, find it within his time to go out of his way to try to dismiss and downplay the findings of the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, which is rather interesting because it is ultimately that committee that has been finding actual evidence of Joe Biden committing election fraud, along with the Twitter files that have also leaked. But nevertheless, election fraud on the part of Joe Biden that Dev is vehemently trying to deny, despite the fact that I have screenshots of Dev openly admitting that yes, Joe Biden committed election fraud. He just oh so curiously flipped his position on that the moment he realized how utterly damning his old position was, that being that Joe Biden trying to steal the election failed, therefore it's somehow completely okay, or at least forgivable, unlike the Eastman Memo, which also failed, but somehow still makes Trump utterly irredeemable, because reasons. Even though the election fraud that Biden committed completely justifies the Eastman Memo even under the most extreme interpretation that Dev took of it. For those curious, the way that Biden committed the election fraud during the 2020 election was via colluding with government agencies to publish misinformation by having those government agencies claim that the Hunter Biden laptop story was just Russian disinformation and not real, even though said agencies at that time had very real proof demonstrating that no, it was not Russian disinformation, and instead the Hunter Biden laptop was very real. This not only led to the story getting censored by social media outlets, being pressured to do so by the government, which is extremely egregious in its own right, but even ignoring that, the very act of government agencies posting deliberately false information just to help their preferred political candidate win is still more than enough to constitute election fraud via misinformation, as demonstrated in examples such as the 1970 Chilean presidential election. The best that Dev actually manages to do to try to counter this is utilize a bait and switch fallacy by focusing on the mail-in ballot story and other things that have no relation whatsoever to election fraud via misinformation, which is to say he never actually talks about election fraud via misinformation, and instead bold-facedly claims that there was no election fraud, period. But curiously enough, that there was also too much evidence that there was no election fraud, period, to cover in just one video. His 4-hour-long video that is supposed to be a complete compilation of all the evidence either way with regards to the Eastman Memo situation, which just so happens to exclusively omit evidence that would suggest that the Eastman Memo was not an example of election fraud or a coup attempt. I am very curious to see what magical evidence that Dev has that's going to take several hours in length to explain why he believes that the government making a statement that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation, how that statement simply never existed apparently, or that news articles that were covering the Hunter Biden laptop story weren't censored by social media outlets that just so happened to be pro-Biden and just so happened to have heavy links to the US government, who just so happened to be pressuring them to censor that specific story, because that's the kind of standards that he would have to make in order to legitimately push the notion that there was no election fraud committed by the Biden campaign. And that again is even before bringing up the fact that Dev himself has admitted that yes, the Biden campaign did actually commit election fraud via misinformation. And keep in mind, all of this denial on the part of Dev is to justify his wild conspiracy theory that having an alternate slate of electors because you believe that election fraud had been committed, which it turns out it was committed, is somehow a coup attempt. The Eastman Memo, at its core, could be described as the legal equivalent of politely asking. Trump was hoping to politely ask and convince Mike Pence to not certify electorates that were achieved under fraudulent conditions. The memo was then essentially politely asking Congress, the legislative branch, or at least the majority of it, to go along with the memo. Finally, the memo was essentially politely asking the Supreme Court, or the judicial branch, to rule in its favor. At its core, the Eastman Memo was a devious plan to politely ask the government not to accept results that were achieved under fraudulent conditions. And this somehow, in the mind of Dev, is an evil coup attempt that makes Trump literally comparable to Hitler. Yes, really, Dev legitimately brings up Hitler's rise to power as somehow comparable to Trump. But fear not, for you see, this is only the mildest criticism possible of Donald J. Trump. And if you dare suggest otherwise, that dev may not be acting in the most honest a manner, that he may actually be a bit delusional, well, you just have Trump derangement syndrome, and your opinions clearly cannot be tolerated on dev's free speech channel. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.